So they say that there are three kind of archetypes of Christian leaders, three kind of basic forms. And they are Peter, who is hands-on, pragmatic, there's a job to be done, impatient with getting on building the church. And then there's Paul, who prioritizes right thinking and right theology and says we need to get that straight first. And then there is John, who would say that what matters most is relationship with God and with other people, and love. And I think it's quite helpful to recognize those different character types. I wonder which type of leader you are most drawn to in church. I wonder which most suits your personality. But of course, it's not as simple as that. If you think about those characters, John became an amazing theologian. Paul built the church. Peter became a faithful teacher. And perhaps that's the point. We need all of these different gifts and different characters. God uses each of them to build his church. We need to learn from each other. And then we have this tendency to slightly pass judgment on each other, to look down on some and say, well, they're not practical enough, or they're not spiritual enough, or they're not theological enough. But the journey that we are all called on is to be learning from each other, to becoming more what God has created us to be. And so this is a sermon about how God challenges each of us to step out of what is comfortable, to sort of leave the harbor and set sail on wider seas. The context of this amazing reading is a mountaintop experience. And I'm sure you've had a mountaintop experience. You know what amazing things they are. This might be the greatest mountaintop experience of all. And in many ways, it's the sort of pinnacle of Luke's gospel. Everything sort of leads up to this point. It's a sort of deeply mysterious story, and yet Luke chooses to place it here right at the center of the gospel because it's that important. We are caught up in the clouds and catch a glimpse of something astonishing. I think significantly, though, it comes in the immediate aftermath, back in verse 20 of Peter's confession of Christ. Do you remember the story where Jesus said to the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And then he says, "Well, who do you say I am?" And Peter says, hugely significantly, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And I think Peter in this story is catching a glimpse of the implications of that thing which he has confessed. But before we get into it, just a comment on prayer. So you don't need me to tell you, you can pray anywhere. You don't need to go to a special place. It works in the supermarket just as it works anywhere else. And yet, Jesus often goes out to wild and remote places to pray. Here, he goes to the top of a mountain to pray. Why does he do that? Why is that necessary? I mean, I'm sure you'd recognize that we are much more conscious of God in the midst of creation. We're reminded of his power and his majesty and his beauty. But I wonder if more than that it's in places like that that our security is just slightly stripped away, that we are more aware of our vulnerability and our dependence on God, that prayer is more immediate in places like that. I would say that if Jesus chooses to do this, to make time to go to wild places to meet with God, then we shouldn't be afraid of doing the same thing ourselves. There is an adventure of prayer, a great discovery of what God has for us. I've often said we're like toddlers paddling on the shore when there is an ocean to be swum in. So here we are, top of a mountain. Jesus is praying. Did you see the disciples were dozing off again? They seem to have form for that. And then something happens, something astonishing. And what it is, frankly, we're not quite sure. Verse 29 says this: As Jesus was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. And two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. We call this the Transfiguration. And there's nothing else like this in the Gospels. There's rare glimpses of something perhaps a little bit like this elsewhere in Scripture. I think of Moses on the top of Mount Sinai, but something exceptional is happening here. And do you notice that there's this kind of dazzling light like lightning, but it's Jesus who Peter sees. That's where the light is coming from. And also, did you spot this interesting thing that Jesus' face is changed? What is going on here? I think Luke, when he's writing the Gospel, says to Peter, are you sure this happened? Are you sure you didn't dream this? And Peter was like, listen, I know I was dozing off, but we definitely, we were wide awake when this happened. And I think it's a valid question, but this clearly is something which Luke takes so seriously. And my suspicion is that what happens in this moment is that Peter and the other disciples catch a glimpse of eternity. That it's as if kind of heaven breaks into reality, and they get to see Jesus. You know, in the immediate aftermath of Peter recognizing who Jesus actually is, that he catches a glimpse of what Jesus is in eternity, what he will be in eternity, as if the veil is drawn back, and he sees Jesus as he really is. We don't know, but it's a remarkable, important moment. And what's obviously also very significant are these two figures that Jesus is speaking with. Verse 30, two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. So you'll remember these. Moses obviously is that kind of greatest of the Old Testament prophets. He gives the people the law. He leads them out of slavery in Egypt. He's massively significant. And of course, he's famous because he was the one who spoke to God face to face. Elijah, likewise, hugely significant prophet, perhaps the greatest of the prophets in the second half of the Old Testament. Interesting detail about Elijah, he apparently never died. He ascended bodily into heaven. So two hugely significant Old Testament figures, but did you see what they're talking about? Verse 31, they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. It's almost like Jesus is kind of consulting with two of the kind of Old Testament greats about all that is to come. And of course, all that is to come is of the most enormous significance. In fact, there's a really interesting detail. When Luke says that they were talking about his departure, that word departure is Exodus. And there is this incredible parallel between what Jesus is doing on the cross and Moses rescuing the people from Egypt. You know, so by which I mean the people of God are being rescued from slavery. They are being set free by those kind of dramatic events of the Passover. Do you remember the sacrificial lamb, its blood smeared on the wooden door frame? And that turns away the very angel of judgment. That what Moses saw is a foreshadow of what is to come in Holy Week and in the Passion. They are preparing Jesus for the greatest and most significant act of his life, which is the cross. But also, I would say, it is not just Jesus who is being prepared. That these disciples, these leaders of the disciples, are also being prepared. prepared. And Peter is this most kind of, I don't know, he's a little bit of he's a pragmatic figure, and he's a rather prosaic man, and he's good and faithful, but he has this astonishing experience. He catches perhaps a glimpse of eternity. And did you hear that the voice which came from heaven, I think, was for the disciples? It wasn't for Jesus. It said, a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." Because it's not just Jesus who needs to be prepared for all that is to come. It is Peter and the others. They are going to be challenged like they have never been challenged before. They are going to struggle to come to terms with why the way of salvation is the way of sacrifice and the way of the cross. The way ahead, down from the mountain, is the way towards Jerusalem. And the Father says, you need to listen carefully to what Jesus has to say to you. Now, Peter is deeply confused by this whole experience and completely admits it. He doesn't really know what's going on. Did you see the great little moment where he starts chattering about building shelters? So he's had this amazing kind of profound experience, and I think he just kind of wants to stay here. You know, if you've caught a glimpse of eternity, why would you want to go back, especially when going back means going to all of that struggle and hardship? But the moment does not last. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Significant and important as this moment is, they have work to do. They have things to be getting on with. They can't stay in this place. It is a remarkable story. And I think these moments for the disciples have a clear purpose, that they are glimpses of what it is that they're striving for and what they are seeking. That the journey of faith is never one of sitting still. We are always being called on to greater and bigger things. We are being called on to glory. Was it Hamlet who said, "There is more in heaven and earth than you have dreamed of"? And Peter catches a glimpse of that. And I think it's intended to stir his heart and to clarify his vision and to strengthen him for what is to come. If he has caught here a glimpse of eternity, this is intended to prepare him for what is to happen. And I think there are moments a little bit like this in the Christian life, that we need to catch a glimpse of something greater. Take an example. We're going to be celebrating communion tonight, and I love communion services. I think they're really very special. They're a really helpful reminder of Jesus' death and passion. But there is this sense that there is something much greater happening when we share communion. There's something sort of profound and mysterious. We say of communion that it is a means of grace, that you are somehow blessed and bettered by taking communion. It's not simply a memorial. There is an encounter with God to be had in the sacraments. Somehow Christ is present in this. As we come to communion, we come expectant that we actually meet with God in some way. Likewise, there are encounters with God to be had in the scriptures and in prayer, in creation itself. We are called ever onwards, deeper into what God has for us. We need pragmatic, hands-on Christians. We need biblically and theologically literate Christians, but we also need Christians who have caught a vision of eternity, who can lead us deeper into that encounter with God that will sustain us and fill us with life and joy. Whatever type of Christian you are, you need to become more. You should be growing and learning from others. We need to be shaken out of that which is comfortable, challenged to a bigger vision of God and a deeper understanding of who he is. We need to seek the presence of God in wild places that which will sustain and envision us when we're going through the hard times. We need that intimacy with Christ, which is the very foundation of who we are. God has so much more for you. You are called to be pilgrims into eternity, and that's a journey which starts now. There's an amazing prayer attributed to Francis Drake, of all people, and I thought this would be a fitting place to end. So this is his prayer. Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we have dreamed too little, when we have arrived safely because we sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, when with the abundance of the things we possess, we have lost our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we have ceased to dream of eternity. And in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of the new heaven to dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas, where storms will show your mastery, and where losing sight of land, we shall glimpse the stars. We ask you, Lord, to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push us into your future in strength and courage and hope and love.